I didn't realize how completely someone could erase you until I stood in the middle of a crowded airport and understood that, on paper, I no longer existed. My boarding pass was gone. My phone wasn't in my bag. And the people I'd arrived with were already disappearing into security without once turning back, their silhouettes shrinking as if distance could absolve intention. The argument that triggered it all replayed in my head with cruel clarity, every word suddenly sounding less like frustration and more like a test I was meant to fail. A test about money, about obedience, about whether I would keep prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own future. And when I didn't, when I finally said no, something shifted in them that I had never wanted to see, a collective decision made in silence that I was no longer worth protecting. So they took advantage of small, ordinary moments I'd never questioned before. Borrowing my phone earlier to save battery. Holding on to my passport to keep documents together. Details that felt harmless until they locked into place like pieces of a trap. And when I realized what was happening and asked where my ticket was, the response wasn't confusion or concern. It was dismissal, calm and cold, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from rehearsed justification. They told me I was grown enough to figure it out on my own, as if abandoning someone in a foreign country without identification or communication was a reasonable lesson, rather than a calculated act of control. I remember the sensation of heat crawling up my neck as panic tried to take over, and how I forced it back down, because even then I knew that showing too much emotion would only make things worse, would turn me from a person into a problem. When I approached the desk to explain, my voice was steady but urgent, words tumbling out faster as I saw skepticism replace empathy in the agent's eyes, their posture shifting from neutral to evaluative. And suddenly I wasn't just stranded, I was suspicious, a disruption that needed to be managed. It hit me then how easily a narrative can form when you lack the tools to counter it. How quickly silence can be interpreted as instability when others are speaking for you. That was when I noticed him. Not because he was loud or dramatic, but because he wasn't part of the chaos. He stood apart from it, observing with a stillness that felt deliberate. Dressed sharply but not ostentatiously, the kind of presence that suggested he was accustomed to moving through spaces where rules bent for him rather than against him. When our eyes met, there was no surprise there, no judgment, just a brief assessment that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt all day. As security shifted closer, he closed the distance between us with quiet precision, leaning in just enough that his words were meant only for me. He told me to pretend I was his spouse, because his driver was arriving and there was no time to explain. Before fear or logic could argue back, he added something else. Something that landed with more weight than any promise of help. He told me to trust him, because the people who had done this would regret it. Not as a threat. Not with anger. But with a calm certainty that cut through my panic and anchored me to the moment. Because certainty is contagious. And in that instant his confidence became a lifeline. I didn't analyze it. Didn't question his motives or consider how reckless it sounded. I simply took his arm and walked, my heart pounding as we moved past security with the ease of people who belonged. The air changed as we exited the terminal, and the noise dulled behind us, replaced by the quiet of a waiting car that felt impossibly insulated from everything I had just been through. When the door closed, sealing me inside, the reality of what had happened hit harder than the fear and left behind a hollow ache where trust used to be. And as the city slid past the window in streaks of light and shadow, I stared at my reflection and barely recognized the person looking back. Someone suspended between the life she thought she had and the one she had just fallen into. The man beside me didn't rush to fill the silence, which I appreciated more than I could have articulated then. When he finally spoke, it was with the same measured tone, introducing himself only enough to establish context. He explained that he needed someone credible at his side for a limited time, someone who could navigate scrutiny without cracking. As he talked, I realized he wasn't offering rescue. He was proposing an alliance. A temporary convergence of interests born from mutual vulnerability. And that distinction mattered. I had spent too long being rescued only to discover the strings attached afterward, and I was done confusing help with ownership. He explained that he'd been watching the situation unfold, not out of curiosity, but because the way I handled it stood out. The absence of theatrics. The focus on solutions until there were none left. Hearing that reframed the moment in a way that steadied me, because it suggested that even stripped of resources, even betrayed, I still had agency. I still had value that wasn't defined by how useful I was to my family. He laid out what he could offer plainly: immediate safety, resources, discretion, assistance in uncovering what had really motivated the abandonment I'd just experienced. As he spoke, my thoughts sharpened, connecting dots that had always hovered at the edge of my awareness. Patterns of financial pressure disguised as concern. Decisions made on my behalf without my consent. My independence framed as instability whenever it threatened their access. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that leaving me there hadn't been an impulsive act of anger. It had been a story they could control, while I was too busy surviving to challenge it. By the time the car slowed and turned onto a quieter street, the initial shock had settled into resolve. Because if they were willing to go that far, then whatever came next would require me to stop assuming they would eventually do the right thing. And that realization was both devastating and strangely liberating, stripping away the last excuse I had for not drawing firmer boundaries. As we arrived at a private entrance and the driver stepped out, opening the door with practiced efficiency, I felt the weight of choice settle on my shoulders. Not the illusion of choice I'd lived with for years, but a real one, sharp-edged and undeniable. Stepping out of that car meant committing to uncertainty on my own terms rather than returning to a familiar pattern that had just proven how conditional its love really was. And as I placed my feet on the pavement and straightened my posture, I understood that whatever this alliance became, whatever complications it introduced, it marked the first decision I had made purely for my own survival and dignity. Not to keep the peace, not to earn approval, but to protect myself from people who had shown me exactly how expendable they believed I was. That understanding, painful as it was, carried with it a quiet promise. I would never again mistake access for affection or obligation for loyalty, because the moment they walked away without looking back, they forfeited the right to define who I was or what I deserved. And from that point forward, every step I took would be guided by that truth, whether they were ready to face the consequences of it or not. The hours that followed blurred together in a way that felt unreal, like my mind was cushioning itself against moving through spaces designed for privacy and control instead of crowds and confusion. And the contrast was jarring enough to keep me alert even as exhaustion settled into my bones, the kind of tired that comes not just from lack of sleep, but from emotional whiplash. And yet, beneath it, there was a current of clarity I hadn't felt in years, because for once I wasn't anticipating someone else's reaction or adjusting my choices to keep tension low. I was simply responding to what was directly in front of me, which turned out to be a quiet, carefully managed environment where nothing happened by accident. He explained the basic expectations without dramatizing them, emphasizing discretion, consistency, and mutual protection. What struck me most was that he never once implied I owed him gratitude, never framed his intervention as generosity that required repayment beyond what we explicitly agreed to. That alone distinguished this arrangement from so many dynamics I'd been trapped in before, where help came bundled with leverage, and every favor was logged for later use. Once I was settled into a secure space, given fresh clothes and a way to communicate again, the first thing I did was reach out to the one person who had always hovered just outside the family orbit, close enough to know the patterns but distant enough not to be fully entangled. The moment I heard her voice tighten with concern before she tried to mask it, I knew my instincts had been right. She confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. The story about my absence was already forming, framed not as abandonment but as a breakdown. Not as something done to me but something caused by me. Hearing it spoken out loud made the situation snap into focus with brutal precision. They weren't worried about my slipping out of their hands, about assets and decisions they could no longer steer once I asserted independence. Stranding me hadn't been about punishment. It had been about creating plausible deniability while laying groundwork for a larger move, one that relied on the assumption that I would be too disoriented, too ashamed, or too busy fixing immediate problems to notice what was happening behind the scenes. When I relayed this to the man who had intervened, he didn't react with surprise or outrage. Just a measured nod that told me he had anticipated something along these lines. He immediately looped in legal counsel without hesitation, not to escalate emotionally but to establish a paper trail, because he understood something my family was counting on me not understanding. Perception solidifies quickly in systems built on documentation, and the longer you wait to counter a narrative, the harder it becomes to dislodge. Watching that process unfold was both intimidating and empowering. It revealed how much damage could be done quietly by people who presented themselves as concerned and reasonable, and how important it was to meet that calm manipulation with equally calm resistance grounded in facts rather than emotion. As days passed and plans took shape, I found myself stepping into the role I had agreed to with more ease than I expected. Not because I enjoyed pretense, but because the environment demanded competence, and competence was something I knew how to deliver. I paid attention to details, anticipated needs, and smoothed over friction before it could become visible. The more I did, the more apparent it became that I wasn't merely filling space. I was adding stability. And people responded not to labels, but to consistency. I was quietly assembling my own defense, gathering records, correspondence, and evidence of independent decision-making that painted a very different picture from the one my family was attempting to circulate. Doing so felt like reclaiming parts of myself I had been taught to downplay: the organizational skill, the foresight, the resilience. Traits that had been reframed for years as rigidity or emotional distance when they didn't serve someone else's agenda. There were moments, usually late at night when the world went quiet, that doubt crept in, whispering familiar questions about whether I was overreacting, whether cutting ties so sharply was necessary, whether I should try once more to explain myself in the hope that reason might prevail. But those thoughts were always countered by the memory of their backs as they walked away without a word, the ease with which they had removed every safety net and justified it to themselves. That image grounded me in reality more effectively than any reassurance could have. The deeper I got into this new rhythm, the clearer it became that my presence served as more than a temporary solution to his problem. It disrupted an internal challenge he was facing, one that mirrored my own in unexpected ways. Just as my family questioned my competence under the guise of concern, there were forces around him eager to frame vulnerability as incapacity, to use a moment of human weakness as leverage in a struggle for control. Seeing that parallel stripped away any lingering illusion that this situation was purely transactional. It was strategic, yes, but it was also reflective, a convergence of two people navigating systems that punish perceived instability regardless of context. When external pressure mounted, it did so predictably, through whispers and carefully timed doubts rather than direct restraint more than aggression. A willingness to let consistency speak louder than rebuttal. I found that I was uniquely positioned to reinforce that approach, because I understood intimately how narratives of instability are constructed, and how easily emotion can be weaponized when you give others the material to do so. We presented a united front not through grand displays, but through quiet alignment, making decisions together, appearing grounded and unremarkable in ways that denied critics the spectacle they were hoping for. That steadiness began to erode the momentum of the doubts circulating around us, even as it intensified the frustration of those who had expected things to unravel. Meanwhile, the legal maneuvering on my family's side became more aggressive, a sign that their initial plan wasn't yielding the quick compliance they had anticipated. When formal notices arrived, cloaked in language about care and protection, I felt a flash of anger so sharp it surprised me. Not because of the threat itself, but because of the audacity, the insistence on recasting harm as help. Instead of reacting impulsively, I did the opposite. I slowed down, documented everything, and prepared to meet them on the only ground that mattered, the one where evidence outweighs emotion. Confronting that reality forced me to reckon with the painful truth. The people who taught me to value family above all else were now relying on that same value to disarm me, to make resistance feel like betrayal. Recognizing that tactic for what it was didn't make the grief disappear, but it stripped it of its power to control my choices. As preparations intensified on both fronts, the alliance I had entered into solidified in ways that were subtle but significant, built on mutual respect rather than dependency. I felt what it was like to operate without second-guessing my right to take up space, to be decisive without apology, to trust my own assessment of a situation even when others disagreed. The confrontation, when it finally came, was less dramatic than I had imagined and far more revealing. It didn't arrive with raised voices or public scenes. It arrived through carefully worded requests for meetings, through messages framed as concern that carried unmistakable undertones of urgency. By the time I agreed to face them, I had already accepted that whatever version of reconciliation they were offering would come with conditions I was no longer willing to meet. When they stepped into the room, eyes scanning the space as if trying to assess how much control they had already lost, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The kind that comes when you've already mourned what you're about to let go of. They spoke first, leaning heavily on familiar language, reminding me of everything they had sacrificed, everything they had done in my best interest, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the airport or the calculated nature of what followed. Listening to them, I understood something with striking clarity. They genuinely believed their version of events. Rewriting reality wasn't a conscious lie. It was a survival mechanism, a way to preserve their self-image even at the cost of mine. When I laid out the facts calmly, the documentation, the timelines, the inconsistencies, their composure cracked not with guilt but with frustration. Facts are inconvenient when they threaten a narrative built on emotional leverage. Instead of engaging with the evidence, they shifted tactics, questioning my judgment, implying that the choices I had made since leaving proved their point, that aligning myself with new allies was further evidence of instability, rather than a rational response trying to be understood, and focused instead on being clear. Clarity doesn't require agreement, only resolve. I told them plainly that any further attempts to interfere in my affairs would be met with formal resistance, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Watching that boundary land, watching them realize that the dynamic had changed irreversibly, was both painful and empowering. It confirmed what I had long suspected, but never allowed myself to fully accept. The relationship I had been fighting to preserve had only ever existed on their terms. After they left, the silence felt heavier than before, not because of loss but because of finality. Sitting with that weight forced me to acknowledge the grief I had been postponing. The grief of letting go of the hope that they would eventually choose me over control. Processing that grief wasn't a single moment, but a gradual unwinding. One that unfolded alongside tangible progress in my own life as legal challenges dissolved under scrutiny, and attempts to question my competence fell flat against a record of consistent, rational decision-making. The systems they had tried to use against me responded not to their fear, but to evidence. When rulings came down in my favor, dismissing their claims as unfounded, I didn't feel triumph so much as relief. The victory wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about securing the freedom to move forward without the constant threat of being pulled backward into chaos I didn't create. At the same time, the alliance that had begun in desperation evolved naturally toward its conclusion, having served its purpose without consuming either of us. There was something deeply affirming about ending that chapter cleanly, without resentment or drama, honoring the role it played without clinging to it as an identity. It reinforced a lesson I was finally internalizing. And partnerships don't have to blur into obligation to be meaningful. As external pressures receded, space opened for something I had rarely allowed myself before. Ambition unfiltered by guilt. I poured that energy into building something of my own, drawing on skills I had honed quietly for years, transforming crisis management and strategic thinking into a professional foundation that grew steadily, not explosively, but with a solidity that felt earned. Each step forward reinforced my trust in my own judgment, a trust that had been systematically undermined for so long that reclaiming it felt like learning a new language. There were moments when echoes of the past surfaced, familiar phrases or situations that once would have sent me scrambling to appease. Each time, I chose differently, responding with calm detachment rather than reflexive compliance. The grip of those old patterns loosened a little more, until one day I realized they no longer dictated my reactions at all. The distance from my family remained, not as a punishment, but as a boundary. It was maintained not out of anger but out of clarity. When occasional messages arrived, tentative and cautious, I read them without urgency, recognizing the difference between remorse and regret, between missing access and missing connection. Choosing not to respond wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-respect that no longer required justification. Standing in the life I had rebuilt, surrounded by people who valued transparency over control and collaboration over compliance, I could see the airport for what it truly was. Not the place where I was abandoned, but the place where the illusion finally collapsed, forcing me to confront a truth I had been circling for years. Loyalty demanded at the expense of dignity is not loyalty at all. And sometimes the most painful exits are the ones that lead you back to regret it hadn't been promising revenge. I understood that now. He had been pointing toward consequence, the inevitable outcome when people underestimate someone they believe they own. Watching those consequences unfold quietly, without spectacle, confirmed something deeply grounding. Reclaiming your agency doesn't require dramatic confrontation. It requires consistency, boundaries, and the willingness to walk away even when doing so feels like breaking an unspoken rule. In the end, what changed everything wasn't wealth or influence or even timing. It was the moment I stopped asking for permission to protect my own interests, stopped framing my independence as something to be defended rather than asserted, and accepted that being willing to stand alone, if necessary, was not a failure of family but a fulfillment of self. That understanding, once settled, became unshakable, carrying me forward with a steadiness that no one else could take away, because it was built not on approval but on truth. And truth, once claimed, doesn't need anyone else's validation to endure.